Hello. Welcome back to Wednesday Word. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. I hope you have had a blessed week so far and that you're ready to spend some time with me to kind of really dive in deep to the Word of God. I hope you were with me recently as we studied the book of Romans, and this time we're going to do something that's different. I have really felt for some time that I wanted to go back and do something from the Old Testament. So I've opted to take a look at the book written by the minor prophet Habakkuk. It's not a long book, but it's powerful, and in some ways it is different from some of the others, and I will point those out as we begin to work through that study today. Also, I think you will be shocked at how much what Habakkuk sees, what he is concerned regarding, and how God responds to him will relate to what we face in our world today. I just see an incredible, strong correlation between those things. Sometimes we get lost in the prophet speak, the terminology, the language that's used, and in the difference in cultures, and we lose the importance of seeing the similarities between those times in that day and the things that are happening in our world today. They may not have had our technology. They may not have had their modes of transportation were certainly different. But Solomon said it, there's nothing new under the sun, and there has always been evil, and there have always been people who would not be faithful and true to God. And so because of that, there will always be some things that will be similar. So let's take a look at some foundational information about this book. As I typically do on this first session together, I do want you to understand a little bit about the circumstances of the writing, about the man himself to the degree that we know it, so that we have a better feeling for the background information as we go into the study itself. Now, we do not know very much about the man whose name is on this book, the man Habakkuk. Now, we do know that his name means embrace, and there has been much conjecture about that. Some people believe that it's because God was going to embrace him and comfort him and strengthen him and prepare him to be able to deal with, to share the information that he needed to convey to people. Perhaps some people think it's because maybe he was willing to embrace other people. Maybe he was the kind of person who would encourage and reach out to people, especially as we're going to see in a time of national crisis. Now, we do know he's not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. It's not like his name crops up over and over anyplace else. However, his writings are quoted other places. Now, that it's just he's not mentioned by name. We know that it is possible, we can't be assured of that, but it's possible that he was either a Levite or had something to do with temple worship, because there's actually a musical notation at the end of chapter 3, at the end of verse 19. Basically, it's the equivalent of the term chief musician or choir master. So there's a good possibility, as I said, either a Levite or involved as a participant in temple worship. Now, I will tell you that it is going to be immediately obvious that this man has a strong sense of justice, and he finds it impossible. I hesitate to use that word, but he finds it impossible to ignore the fact that there is an overwhelming wickedness that is rampant, is plentiful in his world among people who are supposed to be God's people. There is unrighteousness all around him. He's obviously learned the importance of running to God when you feel overwhelmed. So when he looks at all this wickedness and he does not know how to cope and to understand what's happening, instead of going to the wrong sources, he goes to God with his questions. And I'm going to tell you from the very beginning, and you'll hear me repeat it over and over, God can handle our questions. He can handle every one of them. Now, there is something distinctly different about Habakkuk. In his prophecy, he does not mention kings that are ruling that will help us date his book. He does not mention specific historical information that could perhaps be helpful to us. He does give some details, though, that we'll come across and do exactly what we need to do, and that is date the writing of this book. So what was going on in his world at the time of this writing that will help us know what's about to occur, what time frame we are dealing with? Now, it's going to become immediately clear that God is going to use the Chaldeans, also known as the Babylonians, to punish Judah in general and Jerusalem in particular. Now, let's make something really clear. The Chaldeans were an old and ancient culture. I'll come back to that in a minute. But that usually, Chaldea is more of an area. Babylonia is the chief city in that area. So you will hear me use Babylonians and Chaldeans almost interchangeably, and that is not inaccurate. So don't allow that to confuse you. So here's what we know. The Chaldeans are rising in power. They are basically in the process of subjugating the Egyptians and the Assyrians. Now, the Assyrians, you need to remember, they're the ones that originally attacked the northern kingdom, mixed their people in, hauled part of the northern kingdom off, and they're partially responsible for what happened in the area of Samaria. I mean, the northern kingdom was wicked. They had more wicked kings than Judah did, and so you saw the fall of the northern kingdom happen earlier. But at this point, the Assyrians have basically declined because Babylonians have moved in and are stronger. What's interesting, though the Egyptians and the Assyrians are being subjugated by the Babylonians absorbed some of the methodologies of the Assyrians, which I think is really strange. Now, Judah, at best, is spiritually rebellious at this time. They are unfaithful to God. I would send you to 2 Kings chapters 24 and 25 to read more to understand that. So Josiah's righteous rule, where he called the people to come back to reinstate the temple worship process, those things have kind of passed on by, and all you have to do is go read about the heirs to the throne after Josiah. They were wicked, they were horrible. And even though the practices in the temple have not necessarily been stopped during all of that time period, I just might as well go ahead and say it. You can offer a sacrifice in a temple, and that does not mean that your heart is humble and obedient and willing before God to allow him to be Lord of all. So because of that, you can safely say the world around Judah is basically at war because of what's going on with Assyria and Egypt as Babylon establishes or is beginning to establish power. Now, the rise to power is certainly not complete, but that is the up-and-coming group at this particular point. The threat of invasion from the north would be something that Judah would be living with every single day. So there is internal unrest, there's turmoil in Judah, and there's a lot of there are a lot of things going on in Judah that just should not be happening, and I will come back to those. So every indicator that we have suggests that Habakkuk probably wrote this short book sometime between the fall of Nineveh in 612 BC and the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. And more than likely, it was probably between 608 and 598 BC. Okay, that being said, what do we know? We have strong indication, based on a couple of things that we will see, that Habakkuk probably lived long enough to live through all of those horrible things that happened. What kind of horrible things? Well, Nebuchadnezzar invaded Judah on his way back home from battles with Egypt and took a lot of captives back to the Chaldean capital of Babylonia, including Daniel and his friends, around 605 BC. In about 597, Chaldean forces invaded Jerusalem the second time, did horrific damage to the temple, took about 10,000 more captives back to Babylonia, including the prophet Ezekiel. So Daniel went in the first run, Ezekiel was carried back in the second trip. And then there was a third one, because King Zedekiah tried to break free from Chaldean control about 11 years later. And so Nebuchadnezzar vindictively attacked Jerusalem and squashed any attitudes of rebellion, totally destroyed the temple and burned it, destroyed the city, left it in ruins and waste, and most of the remaining survivors were hauled back to Babylon. They were exiles. And we know that was a very real thing. It happened to Judah because of their rebellion against God, because they did not practice the Sabbath rest for the land. And so you have 490 years of no letting the fields be fallow and the ground heal. And so you end up with 70 years of captivity. Now, unlike Jeremiah, who lived at the same time and prophesied in Jerusalem in the midst of that mess, Habakkuk does not talk to or write to the wicked who've rebelled against God, who are idol worshipers, who are whatever it is they are, anything except obedient to God. Habakkuk does not direct his thoughts in a scathing way toward people who are in rebellion. Quite the contrary, and quite in contrast to some of the other prophetic books. He's not talking to the backslidden, he's talking to the faithful. He's talking to the people who are about to suffer, even though they are not the ones who have done anything that is wrong. They've remained faithful to God. And it's a struggle for him. He does not understand why righteous people need to suffer, why they will have a hard time when it's not their fault that punishment is coming, that retribution and the consequences of sin are about to be meted out. So this book is different in that respect, and as I've already said, is extremely relevant for our day. We are often reminded that the righteous suffer for what wicked people do. That was true in Habakkuk's day. It is still true today. Now, it seems, as we will get into the book shortly, that Habakkuk has either already wrestled with the irony of the fact that God is going to use a very wicked people to punish people who are his chosen people. And to Habakkuk and to us, that is ironical. If he hasn't completely wrestled with it, at least he's in the process of trying to do that, because it's a disturbing issue to think about a holy God using blatantly wicked people to accomplish his purposes. And oh my goodness, the Chaldeans qualify. They are hardly good people. They are, not only are they idol worshipers, they're vicious people. So Habakkuk has to work through that. And in a way, we're going to get to see part of that journey as he works through that process, as he moves from doubt to worship. In fact, if you look at the first 4 verses of this book, and we will shortly, and then you look at verses 17 through 19 of chapter 3, which is the end of this short book, you're going to see that the difference between those 2 passages is totally striking. So we're going to watch this man move to a place that he's going to be able to assure other people that it's going to be okay. Here's probably the reason why. At the center of this book, at the foundational level, is the credo of faith that says the just shall live by faith. And that's not a strange idea to us, even in the New Testament. Paul certainly has a lot to say about that statement from Habakkuk. In fact, he reminds us that the just shall live by faith, whether it's Habakkuk's day, the day of the early church, or the day in which we live. Let me just remind you of a few from the writings of Paul and from the anonymous writer to the Hebrews. Romans 1:17, the just shall live by faith. Galatians 2:20, the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God. Galatians 3:11, the just shall live by faith. And then Hebrews 10:38, writer we don't know, but maybe Paul, the just shall live by faith. Either Paul wrote it or the party knew what Paul had written. So, okay, here's the core premise. The just are going to live by faith. That means if bad things happen to us or if good things happen to us, we walk by faith and not by sight. We're going to hear that, and not only that, we're going to see Habakkuk model that as well, which I think is critical. And as we watch this man, as I've already mentioned, he's going to teach us that it is okay to take my questions to God. He can handle them. And we can even rise above the difficult and negative circumstances in this life by focusing on the God who stands above and is above anything and everything we will confront. Now, the book has an interesting layout. Chapters 1 and 2 are basically a dialogue between Habakkuk and God. Habakkuk asks some tough questions of God, questions about God's plans, and God gives him some very revealing answers. In chapter 3, there's a shift. Habakkuk literally composes a prophetic song of praise. It's like a prayer song in response to God's revelation of love for those who are doing right, and his ultimate plan for destruction for those who are not doing right, who do wrong. Among other things, this song in chapter 3 literally celebrates God's power and his promise to ultimately bring salvation to his people. Now, in those 3 short chapters, not only do we have dialogue for 2 and a song of prayer praise in the 3rd chapter, we actually have 3 different forms of writing in that short amount of material included for us. Dialogue first, as I've already said, classic prophetic woes. You're going to hear the word burden, which is common. You're going to hear the negative pronouncements, which is common, especially in verses 6 through 20 of chapter 2, and then the prophetic song. But I have to tell you, in all of it, there is very eloquent language in the original language, very expressive language. There is the use of metaphors as Habakkuk will try to make his message understood, that he is to convey to the people from God. As a man, in the process of these 3 short chapters, we're going to see some character traits that are critical, especially when times are tough. And I think that it's going to be important for us as believers to latch on to these concepts, because Habakkuk is willing to ask the tough questions, the honest questions of the Lord. He has an unshakable faith. We're going to see it. Remember that credo, the just shall live by faith. And he has great concern for spiritual revival. May God stir up those same characteristics within us. When he resorts to this song prayer that's prophetic in chapter 3, he is going to present for us one of the most awesome descriptions of God in all of the Bible. In fact, no prophet in the Old Testament, I don't care how long their book is, I don't care if they have the designation major prophet instead of minor, none of them are more eloquent and expressive on the issue of faith than Habakkuk is. Not only in his written message, but in his personal life example as well. It's definitely worth our noting that his personal life gives credence to what he wrote as a prophet. I think there's a lesson for us there as well. It doesn't matter what I say. If my life does not back up what I say, then it's not going to be very effective and it's not going to have much impact. Now, because the contents of that concluding psalm or prayer provide a really climactic end to the problems that are posed in the first 2 chapters, this whole book can be considered to be a theodicy. Now, in case you don't know that word, it is an argument or a presentation that literally vindicates, that validates God's divine goodness and his providence despite the existence of evil. Even if God allows people to reap what they sow, he's still good. And this is going to be a classic example of that. And I remind you, that word is theodicy, and you don't hear it very often, but you're about to study one with me. So in that respect and in that timing, let's prepare now to go to our reading. Remember, as we start this book, we're going to see dialogue between Habakkuk and God. He's got questions, God's got answers. And I remind you one more time, God can handle our questions. So let's look at Habakkuk and let's look at his questions, and let's learn to follow his pattern in taking our questions to God and see what we can learn from this dialogue. Okay, chapter 1, and as I mentioned a moment ago, let's look at the first 4 verses. And it says, "The burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw," hold on to that word. "O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contention arises. Therefore the law is powerless, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore perverse judgment proceeds." Did you count? Every time he says, God, I've got questions. Now, it's very, very common for prophetic utterances to be called burdens, and that's what he did. It starts that way, the burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw, especially if the prophet is about to make an announcement of something that is ominous or threatening. Here, Habakkuk loathes. I might use a word that's not quite as strong, but the truth of the matter is he loathed what was about to come to his people. Devastation, subjugation, negative things, exile. It was coming. He also loathes the fact that there is a sense of foreboding for him attached to those ideas. He knows the righteous will suffer with the wicked, and at the same time, he feels that burden and also that loathing concerning the Chaldeans, because they have no reverence or respect for God. In fact, they basically worship the fact that they're powerful and vicious and vindictive and wicked, and they're conquering other people. At the end of verse 1, or that phrase that introduces verse 1 there at the very end, did you notice it said that it's the burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw? And I told you to hold on to that word, because the word that's used there is a technical term that it's translated from, and it indicates that the content of this book is a revelation, and that it was so real to Habakkuk, it was as if he could see it with his natural eyes. So the Holy Spirit of God has so impressed Habakkuk with this message that he, in the inner consciousness level, there is so much force, it's as if his eyes in the natural can see something. That same idea is found in 1 Kings chapter 22 and verse 17. And it reads, "Then he said, I saw all Israel." I saw them scattered on the mountains as sheep that have no shepherd. And the Lord said, "These have no master. Let each return to his house in peace." So it was something that the prophet saw. Habakkuk saw, not literally, but with such internal strength, with such impressing of the Holy Spirit, that it might as well have been a picture in front of his face. Now, beginning in verse 2, Habakkuk has obviously been distressed for some time regarding conditions in Judah. He does not like it. And through a series of questions, literally a series, he calls on God, like, "God, why haven't you set things order? Why don't you deal with people who are mistreating other people?" He sees social corruption. He sees spiritual rebellion, and it is all around him. And his overarching question is one that people commonly ask today. Why doesn't a good, a righteous God stop the existence of and the destruction caused by evil? In other words, you've heard it and I have too. How could a good God allow that horrible stuff to happen? So he's basically asking that question for us. God, how could these terrible things that I see every day be happening? You let me see them. You almost call them to my attention, but then they don't stop. It's like Habakkuk believes the people have no conscience. And in response to those observations, his cries have been lifted to God, and he's seeking God's power to correct all of the wrong. There's a little bit of accusation, may be too strong a word. Let's try insinuation, that God is being passive because he's allowed all of these evil actions to continue unhindered, unthwarted, unstopped. He wants to know why evil is allowed to go on so long and why prayers don't seem to be answered in a timely manner. Okay, I have to go there. And how many times have we felt that? God, I've prayed for this for 10 years. God, this evil has been a thorn in my flesh for 10 years. God, this problem has existed for 5 years. Why haven't you already done something? Now, Habakkuk just doesn't understand. We can relate to that. Why allow me to see this? Why reveal it to me? And then act as if you're unconcerned about it, or at least you're certainly not doing anything about it. I relate to that. I totally do. We may have even asked God those same questions, and merciful heavens, ungodly people use that rationale that's illogical, but it's still their rationale all the time. If there was a good God that had power like you say he has, he wouldn't allow all of this to happen. They haven't figured out you can't have your cake and eat it too. Either people have free wills or they don't. Okay. Now, though it doesn't seem that way at first glance, Habakkuk is really not expressing doubt in God. He's expressing his faith and his confidence in a God who is holy, knowing that a holy God ultimately will be compelled because of his justice to address evil. He cannot wink and blink forever. There is a reckoning day coming for those who are committing evil deeds. So I need to clarify here. He's not doubting that God has heard his cry, even though it kind of sounds like it a little bit. Nor is he displaying a cynical or defiant attitude toward God. That is not true either. He simply is confident enough in God to bring these heart level, these deep and concerning questions to the only one who can do anything about it. He trusts and has faith in God and believes that God is going to have an answer for him. He's actually approaching God from a submissive standpoint. He's sincere, and as I've already said over and over, we're going to see that his faith is consistent. He's not about to turn his back on God because things are hard. I don't know why it is that hard times make people run from the only one who can make a difference in those difficult times. Despite all of that, he longs for answers. He seeks God's face, knowing the answers lie there, and he assumes, maybe a little erroneously, that the very fact that God hears him is basically equivalent to God answering him. And I believe God answers prayer unless I'm praying out of God's will or unless I'm praying while harboring sin in my heart. But sometimes his answers are wait. Sometimes his answers are no. Sometimes his answers are yet. And I believe that a lot of times, because we still need to grow, we get the not yets. Okay. So thinking about Habakkuk's approach reminds me a little bit of Psalm 22, verses 1 through 2, where that cry goes out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we know that's prophetic. Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but you do not hear, and in the night season, and am not silent. So both prophetically in reference to Jesus and certainly as our hearts relate to the psalmist, we know that Habakkuk, the psalmist, all of us at times, we're calling out to God and he seems far away. He's not, but he seems far away. So Habakkuk is most definitely calling out to God. Now, there is a slight difference of opinion on an issue, and I will express it so that you can know that it exists. And that's related to the violence that Habakkuk is describing. There is a little bit of an argument from a few people that Habakkuk is talking about the Chaldeans here. I personally don't think that makes sense. I mean, he's obviously describing people, in my opinion, in Judah who are wicked and who are resorting to violence against each other. Because of the spiritual condition of Judah at this time, it makes perfect sense to me to conclude that there was rampant wickedness, there was mistreatment of their fellow man, and it was right there all among the Jews. Do I have to remind you that when people are not walking in obedience to God and in righteousness, that violence and inhumanity to man is a direct result? Look at our world. I am weary with hearing of mass shootings, of family members killing each other, of the heinous acts that are committed when people are not living right and serving God according to the principles of Scripture. Our world's a classic and perfect example. When evil men commit evil acts, that's what you get. When evil men control the justice system, and when I say man, that's not a gender idea. I don't care if it's a man in a high position or a woman. If you're not making decisions based on righteous principles, then as far as the benefit to the people, it'd be better if there were no decisions in that arena being made at all. We need righteous people to rule. We need righteous laws and righteous decisions to be made. And we need people to stop giving in to the violent and wicked spirit of this age. Well, Habakkuk is seeing the same thing in his world. Now, I know God's not talking about the sophisticated judicial system we have in our world today. Sometimes I think we have a lot of folks that have a lot of jobs, but I don't know how well things are being handled. The best system for rule is based on divine law. And that divine law, if we had what would really be good for us, that law would be the heart and soul of political, religious, and domestic life. The contention here is that Judah is so seeped in unrighteousness, and it's so severe that law and order were paralyzed, and the wickedness and violence of man to man was out of control. I shouldn't say anything else. I don't have to. He's describing the same attitude that was present in our world. In the next section of our text, God actually answers Habakkuk's questions, and he does it by sharing what he's going to do, what his plan is. He is planning to bring foreign invaders who are going to seize power away from these rulers that are not righteous and have allowed the people to be out of control. In other words, God's going to use the wicked Chaldeans, or Babylonians if you prefer, to correct or to punish at least the wicked inhabitants of Judah in general and Jerusalem in particular. And the first question is going to be, God's going to use people who are more wicked than the Jews are. Yes, he is. Let's go to our text. Let's start our reading in verse 5. Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days, which you would not believe, though it were told you. For indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans. He's doing what? God elevates whom he chooses, and he can take them down too. For indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards and more fierce than evening wolves. Their chargers charge ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat. They all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand. They scoff at kings, and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold, for they heap up earthen mounds and seize it. Then his mind changes and he transgresses. He commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. So, okay, God is responding to Habakkuk. Habakkuk has expressed his surprise that God has allowed Judah to live in sin without being punished, and God's answer is there and it's clear. I already have plans to punish Judah for its sins, and I'm preparing the instrument that I will use for that punishment. That instrument of discipline would be absolutely beyond what they would have ever comprehended or dreamed or thought would happen. It would be more amazing that he used the Chaldeans than it was that his tolerance of their sin had lasted as long as it had. So, even though it's not apparent in our English translations, God is actually speaking in plural. Other languages have ways to indicate that parts of speech are actually plural better than what is presented here for us in English. He's actually using plural forms because he plans to speak through Habakkuk to the people who will hear. Now, I told you that Habakkuk is quoted. Paul actually quotes from verse 5 in describing God's dealings in Habakkuk's day in reference to the wicked Jews to conditions in the early church. Let me reread verse 5. Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded, for I will work a work in your days, which you would not believe though it were told you. Oh, so what does Paul say? This is Acts 13, verse 41. Behold, you despisers, marvel and perish, for I work a work in your days. Hear that? Same line. A work which you will by no means believe. Is going to amaze you, though one were to declare it to you. So the last part of that verse comes straight out of Habakkuk 1:5. What is Paul's point? Paul is sharing the idea that the fact that God was grafting the Gentiles into that olive tree we talked about when we studied the book of Romans, or to the vine, that the Gentiles were going to share in the blessings that had been promised to God's people, that they were going to be recipients of the salvation that God had presented, that they were going to be part of the fulfillment when Abraham was told that through his seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed. So Paul is saying, look, God's going to do a thing. He's grafting these Gentiles in, and it's going to be amazing. You could not possibly comprehend it or understand it or guess that it would have happened. Okay, so Paul's is kind of a good thing for the Gentiles, but the way Habakkuk uses this is like, okay, I'm going to do something that'll blow your mind. That's what he's saying in essence. You could not possibly have guessed it or understood it, because I'm raising up the Chaldeans or the Babylonians, and I'm going to use them as my instrument of correction for my sinful people. They have sinned, they are living in disobedience and unrighteousness, and they're going to have to be disciplined. So basically, the people had no excuse, because God is plainly telling them what's going to happen and even the source of what is going to happen. I mean, I have to say it, we are without excuse as well. We know exactly what's going to happen. We may not know the day or the hour, but we can see the signs of the times. The Lord's coming is soon. He's coming for those who are watching and who are ready. With the apathy of our day, it's easy to understand how these people were also apathetic. Okay. So basically they're being told, you're not going to believe what's about to happen. They would not accept that a catastrophe was going to come upon them, and that it would be by divine determination, and that he would use very wicked people to accomplish it. So they literally live in a false sense of security, and they think that God, after all, they're God's chosen people. Surely he wouldn't do that to them. But again, that reminds me so much of our day. You remember what 2 Peter 3:4 says, at least the beginning part? Where is the promise of his coming? Oh my. It's typical for people to believe that they can keep on getting away with what they're doing, living in rebellion, because after all, they've done it so far. But we know there's a reckoning day coming one day. Now, I remind you, Josiah reinstituted the ceremonies and the sacrifices in the temple, but that didn't mean the hearts of the people had truly turned to God, or, in this case, since time has passed, that they stayed true to God, or that they passed that commitment down to their children. Furthermore, remember, the kings that came after Josiah were wicked. And if you study the Old Testament writings, you know that as the kings went, very often so the people went. That's a scary thought, isn't it? Especially since so much of the leadership of our day, you could not begin to say they follow biblical practices. Our hearts must not follow after those who are not living and leading in accordance with God's word. You know, this saying, when in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, when the life of a king is described, it says, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. May it not be said of us that we've done evil in the sight of the Lord. Now, so how does a realization that ceremonialism does not equate with true spirituality affect us today? I need you to understand. You can come to church. You can raise your hands in praise and worship. You can sing the lyrics. But if your heart is far from God, all you're doing is participating in a ceremony. True spirituality occurs on a heart level. And it's critical, because God is seeking those who will worship him in spirit and truth. He's looking for true worshipers. Okay, so the Chaldeans are rising to the zenith of their power. That actually happened under Nebuchadnezzar. Now, in that process, it kind of got shifted to his son, but it did start with Nebuchadnezzar. They were actually, like I said, the byproduct of an ancient group of people. And the Chaldeans probably started off as a collection of loosely knitted tribes. We know that Jeremiah does describe them in Jeremiah 5:15. Behold, I will bring a nation against you from afar. Now he's talking to Judah. O house of Israel, says the Lord. I know what he says, but he's talking to Judah. It is a mighty nation. It's an ancient nation, a nation whose language you do not know, nor can you understand what they say. So he says, okay, I'm going to raise a nation up to come against you. They're foreign. They're different from you. They don't speak your language, but they're going to be instruments in my hand. Now, Jeremiah's talking about the Babylonians or Chaldeans, and notice what he calls them. What does he call them? A mighty nation. An ancient nation. So, God's description of the Chaldeans with their soldiers from Babylonia, in our text in Habakkuk, remember how they were described? A bitter nation. A bitter nation, he said. What do you mean it's a bitter nation? And he said they move swiftly. What do you mean they move swiftly? It means that they are impetuous. They are violent. They rapidly and violently move across the land, destroying what's in their pathway. It's intended to portray an army that would be ferocious and that would exact and execute a swift military campaign. You would not want to be the opponent facing their armies. That description is so accurate, and Daniel is going to verify that. Do you remember when Daniel had a vision and he saw these animals, but they weren't normal animals, and he described them? Do you remember how he described the Babylonian Empire? Now, not Nebuchadnezzar's vision. In Nebuchadnezzar's vision, nations were presented the way people see them. In Daniel's vision, nations were presented the way God sees them. So people saw the Babylonian head of gold on the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's vision. But in Daniel's vision, God saw a lion-like creature with the wings of an eagle. Now, what does that mean? The lion would be strong. The lion would represent a ferocious, dominant animal, and the wings would represent lightning speed. You can go back to that description. It's in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 4. So we're talking about people who are ungodly, who are merciless, and who give account to nobody, to no other earthly entity but themselves. In other words, they were arrogant, they were impetuous, they acknowledged no higher authority, so that certainly means they didn't acknowledge God. They denied him to the ultimate degree. They had conquered and destroyed the Assyrian Empire. They had adopted their hateful, cruel methodologies, and they not only conquered peoples and people groups quickly, but they sent the people they conquered into exile, hauling them off to live where they wanted them to live, just like the Assyrians had done before them. Now, again, God used the Assyrians to punish the northern kingdom, and now here come the Babylonians, who are strong and fast and just as cruel, if not more so, against the Jews. Verse 8 has an interesting reference. The passage talks about their horses and all of these different things about their methodologies of fighting. But this reference to evening wolves is an expression that actually occurs several places in the Old Testament. It's in Genesis 49:27, Jeremiah 5:6, Zephaniah 3:3. And it would seem that as it's talking about these Babylonian horses, that they're not only faster than leopards, but they're as ravenous as wolves who hunted all day but did not find any prey, and now they're starving. A description from the Wycliffe Bible Commentary seems to describe this prophesied situation really well to me, and I quote, "War is to the invader as the seizing of prey is to a wild beast, a savage delight." Okay, so we've got vindictive, vicious people who are arrogant, give account to nobody, who move with lightning speed across a land and destroy whatever's in its path, haul the people they capture off into captivity. Oh my goodness, and at the very end of that passage, it talks about flying like an eagle that's hastening to eat, which again reminds us of Daniel's vision that he saw the lion-like creature with the wings of eagles. Now, some argue that eagle is not a good translation here, that a better translation would be the word vulture. It seems in Bible times that there may not have been a strong and clear distinction between the use of the word eagle and the use of the word vulture. You remember what Jesus said in Matthew 24:28? "For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together." Now, we already know that eagles are not scavengers. However, vultures most definitely are. When Jesus talks about carcasses and birds of prey, scavenger birds, gather, it would seem that vulture makes better sense there. We also know that vultures are known for their ability to see a potential meal from very far away, and they fly very quickly to make sure they can stake their claim to the carcass. And then as they eat that carcass, they're voracious. They tear it. They're not nice eaters. So that too seems to describe the Chaldeans and their methodologies and the way things go. Now, verse 9 carries so much meaning. It should be understood that most biblical references to the east wind are associated with destruction. Destruction. Do you remember that Moses summoned the east wind to bring the plague of locusts on Egypt? The east wind parted the Red Sea, and you're going to say that wasn't destruction. It surely wasn't for the Hebrews, but it was for the Egyptians. There are numerous other places where a reference to the east wind occurs in the Bible. Now, you have to understand, if you lived in Palestine, a reference to the east wind was not welcomed, because if a wind came from the east, it came across desert, and it gathered sand in its path as it came. And those winds were dreaded and feared by the inhabitants of Palestine because they blasted crops, they were very destructive, and they were very uncomfortable for people and animals. So notice here that Habakkuk uses a reference to the east wind to describe the faces of the Chaldean invaders who were to come. He goes on to say that they gather their captives like sand, just like that wind blowing across the desert and then blowing across Palestine, meaning that as the east wind picks up sand and relocates it and does it in a destructive way, the inhabitants of Judah were going to find their land destroyed and their people carried into a new place into exile. Verse 10 not only indicates a disdain for other rulers and kingdoms. The Chaldeans didn't care who you were. They didn't care if you had a rulership position. But beyond that, apparently it's a reference to a means by which they would scale walls. Now, did you notice there was a reference to mounds, either something that they built up to help them get over walls, or some way they could at least successfully bridge walls. So you weren't safe, even if your city was a walled city. In verse 11, there's a return to the metaphor of the wind again. It was introduced the first time in verse 9, and when it says his mind changes, the meaning is the army blasts across the land, permitting absolutely nothing to hinder them or to keep them in some sort of boundaries or to contain them. In fact, this enemy, verse 11 tells us, will commit transgressions and offenses, and all in that process believe that his power is basically his God. In other words, the military might of the Chaldeans was like a god to them. They saw themselves as being invincible. The idea that God would use such wicked and vicious people as an instrument of punishment for Judah was shocking to Habakkuk and would be unbelievable to the people of Jerusalem. The only consolation would be the fact that the invaders would one day be judged as guilty before a righteous God, and in time they would face their own divine judgment. So we see in this portion of Scripture, Habakkuk has questions. His world, the world in the southern kingdom of Judah, is a mess. People are unkind and inhumane to each other. Government is not right. Things are just not right. God's in his heaven, but Habakkuk says things in this earth are not right. God comes back, but not with the answer that Habakkuk would have expected. He comes back with, I have an instrument. I'm going to spank my people, and I have just the instrument to use for that process. As I've said over and over, I think we're going to see throughout this book that there is so much similarity to our day. May our heart for God and our passion for God be strong. May we take our questions to the one who has answers. But in the meantime, may we stand and remember that the just live by faith. May we not be deterred by what's around us. Stay strong. Come back with me next time to study Habakkuk.